They told me silence was the only option. But after everything I've seen, everything I've lost, the truth is all I have left.
You know, after 30 years on this bench, I've come to realize that justice isn't just about the black and white letters in a law book. It is a fragile thing, often hidden beneath the noise of the world. I've seen the most powerful men tremble when their secrets were laid bare, and I've seen the poorest individuals stand with a dignity that no amount of gold could ever buy. People often ask me if the world is fair. Most days, I try my best to say yes. But today is a day where the very definition of fairness was put on trial. It was a case that didn't start with a crime, but with a clash of two worlds that should have never met. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Chicago, and the wind was howling off the lake, the kind of bitter cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. Inside Courtroom 402, the air was heavy with a different kind of chill. On one side of the room sat Julian Vane. At 32, he was the golden boy of the tech world, a CEO whose face had graced the covers of every major business magazine. He sat there in a bespoke $10,000 Armani suit, leaning back with an air of supreme boredom. Every few seconds, he would glance at his Patek Philippe watch, his fingers tapping impatiently on the mahogany table. To Julian, time was money, and he clearly felt that every minute spent in this courtroom was a personal robbery of his wealth. And then there was the man sitting across from him, Elias Thorne. Elias is 65 years old, but his face tells the story of 100 years. He wore an old faded army field jacket, the kind with the name tape torn off, but the shadows of rank still visible on the shoulders. His boots were scuffed and salt-stained from the city sidewalks, and his hands, calloused and trembling slightly, were folded neatly in his lap. Elias is a veteran, a man who survived 3 brutal tours of duty and carries a Purple Heart in his pocket. He has bled for the freedoms that allow men like Julian to build empires. Yet here he was, being treated like a stain on the floor of a 5-star city. The case before me seems simple on paper, but nothing is ever truly simple when pride is involved. Julian Vane was suing Elias Thorne for assault and property damage. The incident had taken place outside the Gilded Lily, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Julian claimed that as he was walking to his custom Ferrari, this vagrant, his word not mine, had lunged at him, scratching the pristine paint of his car and causing a public scene. Julian spoke with a voice like polished glass, cold and sharp. He said, "Your Honor, people like this think they can harass productive citizens just because they have nothing to lose. I want him held accountable. I want him off the streets." He didn't even look at Elias. To Julian, Elias wasn't a person. He was a nuisance to be cleared away. I turned my gaze to Elias. I saw the way he swallowed hard, the way his shoulders stayed squared, despite the weight of the accusations. I asked him, "Mr. Thorne, what is your version of that afternoon?" He looked up at me, and for a moment the room seemed to grow quiet. His voice was a low rasp, steady but tired. He said, "Your Honor, I wasn't asking for money. I don't beg. I was walking past the car, and I saw something glinting near the tire. It was my medal. It must have slipped from my pocket. I just reached down to pick it up. I didn't touch him, and I certainly didn't touch his car. I just wanted what was mine." Julian's lawyer let out a short, mocking laugh, tossing a stack of character evidence onto the desk, painting Elias as a delusional man with a history of loitering. But as I looked at the back of the courtroom, I noticed a man who had been there since the doors opened. He was wearing a gray janitor's uniform, his hands gripped tightly around a plastic folder. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't a witness on the list. But the way he was looking at Julian Vane told me that the story Julian was telling was missing its most important chapter. The silence that followed Elias's words was heavy, the kind of silence that makes you realize just how small a room can feel when two opposing truths are fighting for air. I looked at Julian Vane. He wasn't looking at the veteran. He was buffing a microscopic smudge off his cufflink, his expression one of pure, unadulterated annoyance. It was the look of a man who found the presence of poverty to be a personal inconvenience. To Julian, this wasn't a quest for justice. It was a waste of his billable hours. His attorney, a man named Marcus Sterling, stood up with a theatrical sigh. Sterling was the kind of lawyer who didn't just argue a case, he performed it. He adjusted his silk tie and laid a hand on Julian's shoulder as if to protect him from the very air Elias was breathing. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice dripping with practiced concern, "we all respect our service members. My own grandfather served. But let's be realistic. We are talking about a highly erratic individual who approached a high-value asset in broad daylight. My client felt threatened. His property was defaced. We have a repair estimate here for the scratch on the Ferrari, $12,000. $12,000. A murmur rippled through the gallery. That single number was more than what many people in this city earned in half a year of backbreaking labor. Julian leaned forward then, finally finding his voice. It was smooth, arrogant, and carried the weight of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. "It's not even about the money, Judge," Julian said, looking me straight in the eye. "It's about the principle. You can't just let people like this think they can touch things that don't belong to them. They need to know their place. If we don't enforce the law, what separates us from chaos?" I leaned back in my chair, my eyes narrowing. I've heard the chaos argument 1,000 times from people who think the law is a fence designed to keep the unwanted away from their gated communities. I looked over at Elias Thorne. He didn't flinch at the $12,000 figure. He didn't even seem to hear the word vagrant. He was looking at Julian's hands, not with envy, but with a strange, quiet pity. The kind of pity a man who has seen the end of the world feels for a man who thinks he owns it. "Mr. Vane," I said, my voice low and steady, "you speak of the law as if it were a shield for your property. But in this room, the law is a scale. And right now, the scale is struggling to find the weight of your humanity." Julian's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. He looked at his lawyer and whispered something that made them both chuckle quietly. It was a private joke, a shared understanding that they were the hunters and Elias was the prey. They had the paperwork, the prestige, and the power. Then Sterling pulled out a tablet. "Your Honor, we have a witness statement from the restaurant manager. He saw the defendant loitering for 20 minutes before my client exited. He saw him targeting the vehicle." He handed the tablet to my clerk. "The evidence looks solid on the surface, a classic case of a bitter man lashing out at success. But as the clerk passed me the device, my eyes drifted back to the man in the gray janitor's uniform. He was no longer sitting. He was standing in the very back, his face a mask of cold resolve. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at Julian Vane with a look that could strip the paint off a Ferrari. He knew something. And in a courtroom, a secret is the only thing more dangerous than a lie. Evidence is a funny thing. It's supposed to be the bedrock of truth, but in a courtroom, it's often used like a weapon, sharpened by those who can afford the best blacksmiths. Julian's lawyer, Sterling, handed over a USB drive with the air of a man delivering a death warrant. "We have security footage, Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing with a smug certainty. "From the restaurant's valet entrance. It clearly shows the defendant approaching the vehicle and the subsequent altercation." I signaled for the bailiff to play the video on the large monitors. The courtroom dimmed and all eyes turned to the grainy, high-angle shot of the sidewalk outside the Gilded Lily. There it was, the Ferrari, glowing like a polished ruby under the streetlights. And there was Elias. He looked small on the screen, a solitary figure in a sea of luxury. You could see him stop. You could see him look down. And then you saw him bend over, reaching toward the front tire. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "There," he whispered loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Caught in the act." On the screen, Julian exited the restaurant. He was laughing, looking at his phone, surrounded by a group of people who looked exactly like him, expensive and untouched by life. He reached the car, saw Elias near the wheel, and the scene exploded. You couldn't hear the words, but you could see the violence in Julian's movements. He didn't just ask Elias to move, he shoved him. He shoved a 65-year-old man with the kind of force you'd use on a heavy door. Elias fell back, hitting the pavement hard, but his hand stayed clenched around something small. "Stop the video," I commanded. The frame froze on Julian's face, a mask of pure, jagged rage. I looked at Julian. Mr. Vane, the video shows you striking Mr. Thorne. It does not show him striking you. And it certainly doesn't show him touching your paint with anything other than his sleeve as he fell. Julian didn't even blink. He lunged at me, Judge. I was defending my property. The camera angle is deceptive. He had a metal object in his hand, probably a key or a knife. That's what scratched the door. He was trying to rob me, or worse. Sterling jumped in immediately. Precisely, Your Honor. The scratch appeared immediately after this encounter. The circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. We aren't here to judge my client's tone. We are here to judge the damage to a $250,000 vehicle caused by a man who has no business being in that neighborhood. I looked over at Elias. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Julian's father, who was sitting in the front row. The elder Mr. Vane was a man of immense influence, a titan of industry. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on his son, but it wasn't the father who caught my attention again. It was the janitor. He had moved closer to the railing now. He opened the plastic folder just a fraction of an inch, and I saw the corner of a photograph. It wasn't a photo of a car. It was a photo of a woman, and the look on the janitor's face told me that the Ferrari wasn't the only thing that had been damaged that afternoon. The air in the courtroom shifted. It wasn't the biting cold from the Chicago streets anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a lie about to be punctured. I watched as the man in the gray uniform, Henry, as I would later learn, stepped toward the mahogany railing. To a man like Julian Vane, Henry was part of the furniture, an invisible ghost who emptied trash bins and buffed floors. But in my courtroom, the man with the broom often sees more than the man with the badge. Sterling was on his feet before Henry could even open his mouth. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This man is not on the witness list. He has no standing in these proceedings. I request that he be removed immediately for obstructing the court. Julian didn't even look back at Henry. He just shook his head, a disgusted sneer curling his lip as if the janitor's presence was a physical stain on his expensive suit. I held up a hand, silencing Sterling. I looked at Henry. His hands were calloused, his back slightly bent from years of labor, but his eyes were clear and burning with a quiet, righteous fire. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, the truth doesn't always wear a three-piece suit and carry a leather briefcase. Sometimes it carries a mop. I'm going to hear what this man has to say. You can sit down, or you can be held in contempt for interfering with my search for the truth. Henry approached the witness stand, his boots clicking softly on the floor. He didn't look at the lawyers, he looked at Elias Thorne, and for a split second I saw a flicker of recognition between the two men, a silent bond shared by those whom the world chooses to ignore. Henry placed the plastic folder on the ledge. His voice was gravelly but firm. I've worked at this building for 22 years, Judge. I've cleaned up after the best and the worst of them, and I was outside taking my break behind the valet stand when this happened. Henry opened the folder and pulled out a series of high-resolution photographs. They weren't from the restaurant security feed. They were taken on a smartphone. I saw that Ferrari pull up, Henry continued, and I saw Mr. Vane get out. But here's the thing, Judge. Look at this photo, taken at 6:15 p.m., 20 minutes before Mr. Vane even entered the restaurant. The bailiff placed the photo on the overhead projector. The image was crystal clear. It showed the Ferrari's passenger side door while Julian was handing his keys to the valet. There, caught in the late afternoon sun, was the jagged, deep scratch that Julian claimed Elias had caused. It was already there. It had been there before Julian ever laid eyes on the veteran. The courtroom gasped. Julian's face went from bored to a pale, sickly shade of white. His lawyer started fumbling through his papers, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But Henry wasn't finished. He reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. It was old, the fabric worn, but the gold inside shimmered with a sacred light. I found this under the car after the police took Mr. Thorne away, Henry said, his voice trembling with emotion. It wasn't a knife. It wasn't a key. It was this. He opened the box to reveal the Purple Heart. Mr. Thorne wasn't lunging at a car. He was reaching for his life's work. He was reaching for the only thing he had left that proved he mattered. I looked at Julian Vane, the tech giant, the golden boy, the man of the year. He was shrinking in his seat, his hands shaking as he realized that the janitor he had walked past 1,000 times had just dismantled his empire of lies with a single silent click of a camera. The metal object Julian feared wasn't a weapon. It was a symbol of a sacrifice he wasn't capable of understanding. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the soft hum of the overhead lights. Every eye was fixed on that small, velvet-lined box held by Henry, the janitor. Inside, the Purple Heart shimmered, a piece of metal and ribbon that represented more courage than most people in that room would ever know. I looked at Julian Vane. The man who had entered my courtroom like a king was now slumped in his chair, his expensive Armani jacket suddenly looking too big for him. He was staring at the metal as if it were a ghost. I leaned forward, my voice cutting through the silence like a gavel. Mr. Vane, look at that metal. Do you know what it takes to earn one of those? It isn't bought with a venture capital check. It isn't inherited from a wealthy father. It is earned in the mud, in the dark, and in the face of death. It is paid for in blood. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His lawyer, Sterling, was frantically whispering in his ear, but Julian seemed to have gone deaf to everything but the pounding of his own heart. Henry, still standing at the witness stand, turned the plastic folder toward Julian. I didn't just take those photos of the car because I like the color, Judge, Henry said, his voice gaining strength. I took them because I saw Mr. Vane when he pulled up to the curb. He was screaming into his phone, cursing at someone on the other end. He slammed his car door so hard the whole frame shook. He was already looking for someone to bleed on before he even stepped out of that vehicle. He saw Mr. Thorne, a man he thought was invisible, and he saw an easy target for his rage. Julian finally found his voice, though it was thin and brittle. It's a plant. That janitor is lying. He probably knows the vagrant. They're in this together, trying to shake me down for a settlement. But the lie didn't have the same polish anymore. It sounded desperate. It sounded like a man drowning in a sea of his own making. I turned my attention to the front row, to Julian's father. Senator Vane had not moved a muscle. His face was a mask of cold stone, but his eyes were fixed on the photographs of the pre-existing scratch. He was a man who built a legacy on integrity, or at least the appearance of it, and watching his son get dismantled by a janitor was clearly a humiliation he hadn't prepared for. I looked back at Elias Thorne. The veteran hadn't said a word during Henry's testimony. He was looking at his medal, his eyes misty with a combination of pain and relief. He wasn't thinking about the $12,000 lawsuit. He wasn't thinking about the Ferrari. He was thinking about the friends he lost to earn that piece of metal, and the fact that a stranger in a gray uniform was the only one who bothered to pick it up out of the dirt. Mr. Sterling, I said, looking at Julian's lawyer, your client claimed this metal was a weapon. He claimed it was used to deface his property, but the evidence shows the damage was done by your client's own hand before he ever encountered Mr. Thorne. This isn't a civil suit for damages anymore. This is becoming a criminal inquiry into perjury and filing a false police report. Sterling's face went pale. He knew the game was over. He looked at Julian, then at the senator, and slowly took a step back from the table. He was a shark, and sharks don't stay in bloody water when they realize they're the ones being hunted. Julian was alone now, sitting in the middle of a courtroom that had finally seen him for exactly what he was. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your chest. I watched Julian Vane. His eyes were darting around the room, looking for an escape, a loophole, or a friendly face. But everyone, from the bailiff to the tourists in the back row, was looking at him with the same expression, pure, unfiltered disgust. Julian reached out a trembling hand toward his father, who was still sitting in the front row. Dad, he whispered, his voice cracking. Dad, tell them. Tell them this is a setup. You know I wouldn't lie about this. Senator Vane stood up. He didn't move like a man coming to the rescue. He moved like a man walking toward a funeral. He adjusted his dark suit, his movements slow and deliberate, and he didn't look at his son. He looked at me. Then he turned his gaze to Elias Thorne. For the first time in the entire proceeding, the senator's stoic mask crumbled. I saw his jaw tighten, and a flicker of something, was it shame or was it a memory, crossed his eyes. He walked forward to the mahogany railing, bypassing his son's outstretched hand as if it didn't exist. "Your Honor," the senator began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that had commanded Senate floors for decades. "I have spent 40 years building a name in this city. I have stood for the flag, and I have stood for the people who defend it." He paused, his breath hitching slightly. "My father was a veteran. He fought in a war that most people only read about in history books. He taught me that a man's word is his only true currency, and that honor is something you earn every single day you draw breath." He finally turned to look at Julian. The look wasn't one of anger. It was something far more devastating. It was the look of total, absolute disappointment. "Julian," the senator said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, "I gave you everything. I gave you the best education, the best opportunities, and a name that opened every door in the world. But I clearly failed to give you a soul. You sat there and mocked a man who bled for your right to be arrogant. You used your wealth to try and crush a hero because you were too proud to admit you scratched your own toy." Julian's face twisted. "Dad, it was just a car. He's a nobody. Why are you doing this?" The senator closed his eyes for a moment as if in pain. "He is not a nobody, Julian. He is the man you should have been, and the fact that you can't see that is the greatest failure of my life." The senator turned back to me, his posture rigid. "Your Honor, I will not be providing a defense for my son. In fact, I am formally requesting that the district attorney's office investigate the evidence presented by the janitor. If my son has committed perjury, if he has filed a false report to ruin an innocent man's life, then he must face the full weight of the law. No more lawyers, no more bailouts, no more lies." The senator didn't sit back down. He walked toward Elias Thorne. The entire courtroom held its breath as the titan of industry stood before the man in the frayed army jacket. Senator Vane reached out his hand, not the hand of a politician, but the hand of a man seeking redemption. "Sergeant Thorne," he said, using Elias's rank for the first time, "on behalf of my family and on behalf of a city that should have looked after you better, I am deeply, deeply sorry." Julian watched from the defense table, his world crumbling into dust. He had always believed his father's power was a shield. He never realized that for a man of honor, that power is a sword, and it had just been turned against him. I looked around the courtroom one more time. It's a strange thing, how a room can hold so much history, yet, in a single hour, an entirely new legacy can be written. I looked at Julian Vane. He was staring at the floor now, the polished mahogany reflecting a man who had finally run out of things to buy. His father, the senator, had moved far away from the defense table, leaving an empty space between them that felt wider than an ocean. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. "Mr. Vane," I said, my voice steady, carrying the accumulated weight of 30 years on this bench. "You came into this courtroom believing that the law was a tool you could sharpen to cut down those you deemed beneath you. You saw a man in a faded jacket and assumed his silence was a sign of weakness. You saw a janitor in a gray uniform and assumed he was invisible to the world. You believed that because you owned the most expensive car on the street, you owned the street itself. You were wrong on every single count." I picked up the file Julian's lawyer had presented earlier, the $12,000 repair estimate for the Ferrari. I took the paper in both hands and tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping was the only noise in the room, sharp and final. "This civil suit is dismissed with prejudice," I declared, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "There was no assault. There was no property damage caused by Mr. Thorne. There was only a desperate, cowardly attempt by a man with too much money and too little integrity to hide his own mistakes by crushing the life of a veteran. But I wasn't finished. The law isn't just about stopping a lie, it's about answering for it. However, I continued, leaning forward so Julian had to look me in the eye, this court is now opening a criminal inquiry. Filing a false police report is a crime. Perjury under oath is a crime. Attempting to use the judicial system as a weapon of harassment is an affront to every citizen who relies on these walls for protection. I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office immediately. And given the evidence provided by the janitor's photographs and the valet's testimony, I suspect you will find that a jail cell doesn't care about the brand of your suit or the balance of your bank account. Julian didn't look up. He looked like a balloon that had finally lost all its air. The arrogance that had defined him all morning was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting fear. I then turned my attention to Henry, the man who had stood up when everyone else stayed seated. "Henry," I said, and for the first time I let a smile touch my face. "You've worked in this building for over 2 decades. You've seen the powerful come and go. Today, you were the most powerful person in this room. Not because of a title, but because you chose to speak when it would have been easier to remain a ghost. This city owes you a debt of gratitude for reminding us that the truth doesn't have a price tag." Henry gave a small, humble nod. He wasn't looking for a reward. He was just a man who knew what right looked like. Finally, I turned to Elias Thorne. He was still holding that velvet box, his thumb gently brushing over the gold of the Purple Heart. He looked like a man who had finally come home from a war that had lasted far too long. "Sergeant Thorne," I said softly, "the world often forgets the hands that built its safety, but this court remembers. You are free to go, and I hope you leave here knowing that your honor was never in doubt, even if it took a janitor and an old judge to remind the world of it." The gavel hit the wood with a sound that felt like a door closing on one life and opening on another. As the bailiff led a stunned and silent Julian Vane toward the side room for processing, the heavy atmosphere of the courtroom began to lift, replaced by a warmth that had been missing for a very long time. I watched Julian's back. The Armani suit now looked like a costume that no longer fit. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that you can own the world, but if you don't own your own integrity, you are poorer than the man sleeping on the bench outside. I stood up from my chair, but I didn't leave the bench. I looked down at Elias Thorne and Henry, who were now standing side by side. It was a sight I wanted to burn into my memory. The veteran and the janitor, 2 men the world often walks past without a second glance, standing as the pillars of truth in a room built for justice. I descended the steps and walked toward them. In this moment, the robe didn't matter. The title didn't matter. Only the respect between men remained. Senator Vane approached us as well. He looked at Elias, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not a political one, but a private line. "Sergeant Thorne," the senator said, his voice thick with a sincerity that no campaign could ever manufacture. "My foundation works with veterans who have fallen through the cracks. We have a housing program and a staff position for a coordinator, someone who knows what it means to lead and what it means to sacrifice. I would be honored if you would consider talking to us tomorrow. This city owes you a home, not just a courtroom." Elias took the card, his fingers steady now. He didn't jump at the offer with desperation. He accepted it with the quiet grace of a man who knew his worth had finally been recognized. He looked at Henry, then at me. "Thank you, Judge," he said softly. "I didn't come here for a job or a house. I just came for my heart." He looked down at the velvet box. "But it's nice to know that sometimes the heart of the city still beats for people like us." As I walked back to my chambers, I thought about my father. He used to tell me that a man is only as tall as the people he stands up for. Today, because of a janitor who refused to be invisible and a veteran who refused to be broken, we all stood a little taller. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about making sure that when a man like Elias Thorne walks down the street, he isn't seen as a nuisance, but as a hero who just happens to be carrying his medals in his pocket instead of on his chest. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that honor is the only currency that never devalues, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. This courtroom is a place of stories, and every time we share one, we remind the world that dignity is not a luxury. It is a right. Stay close, because the next case on my docket involves a doctor, a broken promise, and a secret hidden in a basement for 20 years. You won't want to miss what happens when that truth finally comes to light. I'm Judge Simpson, and I'll see you in the next session.